Welcome to the OnScript podcast, your home for world-class conversations on scripture and theology, where you get to meet some of the best in the field. Visit us at onscript.study. Say hello on Twitter at OnScript Podcast and stop by our Facebook page at facebook.com/OnScript.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the podcast. This is Matt Lynch coming to you from Regent College in Vancouver. We've got a brand new episode for you with Nijay Gupta talking about his much anticipated book, Tell Her Story. So we hope you enjoy this. Thanks so much for all of you who have bothered to write a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. That's really helpful to us and helps people find the podcast and gets it in front of more people. So if you want to share the word, you can do it that way. Or you can take up one of the many other creative ideas that we've put forth in previous episodes. So enjoy this episode, and thanks so much for listening. Thanks to you who support the podcast, and special thanks to our producers as well.
Well, hello, OnScript listeners. I'm here today with Dr. Nijay Gupta, who is a professor of New Testament at Northern Seminary. He has written or edited over 21 books, including commentaries on Colossians, Thessalonians, Philippians, and some others. And he has several books helping scholars in their research, learning how to write, getting a sense of the field of New Testament studies. But the book we're talking about today is a book that actually has not come out yet. It's Tell Her Story: How Women Led, Taught, and Ministered in the Early Church with IVP Academic. Well, welcome, Nijay.
Thank you. It's good to be back.
And when does this book come out officially?
It comes out in the middle of March.
Okay, so maybe we'll get it, maybe this will air in the middle of March or somewhere around there, so we'll be right on time. But right now, it's actually early 2021, right? We're way ahead of the curve, or 2022, late 2022, that's where we're at right now. Okay, well, since this is technically your third time on OnScript, I'm not going to actually ask you what we typically ask, which is like, how did you get into this? What's your journey into scholarship? But I did have one question that is actually inspired by Michael Gary Scott, if you know him. He was on a documentary in Scranton, Pennsylvania. But I guess the first question that comes to mind when I read a book like this is, where do you, as a man, get off writing a book about women in ministry?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, I've actually had people say that to me on Twitter and other places, you need to get out of the way and let women speak on this. I've actually heard both arguments. One argument is, we don't need mansplaining. We don't need, men to be writing these things. But then, my wife is a pastor. Most of my students, my wife is a pastor. Most of my students are women. And they actually appreciate a man speaking up on this because sometimes women are seen as biased. I don't validate that argument. But this idea that it's self-serving if a woman writes a book on women in the New Testament, or maybe it's not taken seriously. I think it's taken seriously. I take it seriously. But, one of the things I say is we need everybody speaking on this. It's not a woman's issue. See, if it's just women writing on it, it can be perceived by men as a women's issue. I want to speak to my audience, the people that read my work. So I think there's actually room at the table for several voices. The issue is, and IVP has been spectacular working with them. The issue is there legitimate partnership in this discussion? So, for example, number one choice for forward was Dr. Beth Allison Barr, because I wanted to show that I respect her work. I'm building off her work. I'm partnering with her in this work. I'm sure you haven't noticed this yet because, the book hasn't come out. But right now, all the endorsers are women, and that wasn't intentional. We'd asked a bunch of men, we'd asked a bunch of women. I'm connected in well with Christians for Biblical Equality and other groups. So I have these women. So I want to be a voice amongst women rather than kind of a lone ranger. But as I've talked about this with, some folks at IVP, part of this is a mea culpa, Drew, in the sense that part of my story is I was a hardcore, and not hardcore, but I didn't support women ministry when I started seminary. I wrote my very first systematic theology paper on why women shouldn't be in ministry.
Wow.
Or women shouldn't be pastors, I suppose. And I went through a journey. And so I talk a little bit about that in the book, but this is kind of an apology in some ways for some of the damage even I've done. So what I would say to people is read my book, but read Beth Allison Barr, read Cindy Westfall, read Lucy Pepia, read Lynn Kohik, Rediscovering Biblical Equality. And so I'm hoping this will stimulate more conversation.
Yeah, that's good. And you do get a sense of that in the book. Kind of, you can see how you were twisting and turning from these older conclusions, and I think some of the passages even I could tell you were writing because you know what it feels like to not yet be convinced of something going on there. So it's very helpful. It is, though, mainly, I mean, it is a mea culpa, I guess, as you said, but it's also kind of empirically focused. It's really focused on the data of what was going on in the first century, more specifically, but also biblical data starting from Genesis going forward. But when we talk about the biblical data, I hate using the word biblical data because it makes it sound like it's just a commodity.
Cold.
When we talk about what's going on in the biblical literature, there is this question, like a chicken and egg. It shows, you're showing women's participation in various aspects of what we would call ministry today. But there's obviously people who are going to say, well, yeah, women did things, but it's not necessarily a good description, or it wasn't the right thing to do, or they were stepping up in a moment where men were failing, but normally that's not the case. Or even things like, Abraham prostitutes out his wife twice in order to save his own life, right? So the description doesn't necessarily equal prescription. So how do you wrestle with that tension?
Yeah, that's a great question. What I didn't want to do is create a rose-colored, glasses perspective where I just see the Bible as fully supporting women in terms of empowering them and, all this stuff. I try to be honest in the book that the ancient patriarchal world was not good for women. And that it's a good thing that women can vote today, and it's a good thing that women can sue and have rights, and et cetera, et cetera. Drew, that when you asked me to write for the Biblical World of Gender, this little book with Cascade, the first thing I wanted to do was write on whether or not early Christianity respected women slaves. And I intentionally wanted to make sure the answer to that question was ambiguous because I didn't want to come across as apologetic. I think sometimes I get accused of that in my work because I am a Christian. I do believe the Bible is the Word of God, but I also want intellectual honesty. I want to be able to call a spade a spade. And going back to that, I'm glad you noticed that I was trying to approach the book in a new way by focusing more on history than on kind of doctrinal debates. I did that because I kind of feel like we need a reset. We ask these questions that actually are more modern questions, and we impose them onto the Bible, like women can't be, can women be pastors? And the joke I like to use with my seminary students is, number one, there were no pastors in the first century. Number two, there were no sermons. So when we say, can a women preach? And, and so forth. Now, at the end of the day, we can make the argument, yes, there were elders who, and there was shepherding. We can get it a different way, but I think we have to do a reset. And so part of what I try to do in the book is say, what was the leadership structure like? How much diversity was there in terms of how it looks in Philippi versus Corinth? And Drew, really the big punchline I use for the book is we ask, what can women do and not do? But when we look at the actual Bible, women are everywhere and they're doing everything. I know you're an Old Testament person, so I start the book off with Deborah because I feel like she's a great first conversation to have when people say, but women shouldn't be lead pastors. Women shouldn't be elders because they're not as good at that kind of stuff. That's, even though people don't like to say that, that's kind of where they land, is men are just better. And I think what a risk God takes putting Deborah in the pilot's chair in one of the darkest times of Israel's history where they don't have good leadership. What a risk if that were true that God was taking.
Yeah, and even with Deborah, I mean, when I teach it, I stop even before you get to the Barak conversation and say, like we don't need anything past this. We already have this issue of a woman who's sitting under a tree, so named for her, because that's where she adjudicates the Torah, right? And so there's presumed knowledge of the Torah at a certain level, and that she can work through legal issues with people and doing the work that 70 elders were called to do. You've already got something that's like a little bit out of the box from the caricatures of the text. And maybe I want to stop right here and just ask kind of theologically, big picture, like, would you make a hard and fast distinction and say, like, look, if you're the Catholic Church or you're some denomination that just says we want women involved in ministry, but we're not gonna put them in that ultimate position of responsibility for the church or whatever, we're going to reserve that for males. Is, just you personally, is your position more, well, yeah, they just have to absolutely change, or there's room for a plurality on this, and the issue is more excising of women from ministry?
Man, you're going straight for the hard questions. That's a tough one.
Sorry.
I would say, first of all, I think tone is important. And when we go on social media, I mean, it's easy to devolve into accusation and hostility and demonization and, hey, this group is evil, this group is evil. I've learned that over time that feels good, but it's not actually an effective way to build bridges and have healthy conversations. So what I would say is it like inherently evil or whatever? I would say it is limiting. It is limiting the people of God. It's holding them back. And, I guess, I wouldn't put myself in the position of making pronouncements, but I would say is if I were consulting with the Catholic Church, if the Pope called me up,
right,
I would say, okay, maybe your ecclesiology is not going to change, but, let's look at these texts, see what women do, and push as far as we can to giving women voice, allowing women to exercise gifts of leadership. For example, when I was, I don't know, this is a long time ago, so I hope I'm not getting anybody in trouble, but, I went to a PCA church in seminary, and my wife and I just gravitated more towards egalitarian position or over by the end of seminary. And we were going to this PCA church, and we kind of wanted to have some conversations with the pastor about whether we should continue going there. And he basically said, without changing the doctrine, we're gonna push those boundaries as far as we possibly can. So I think that's happening in some groups where they recognize, okay, we have these doctrinal positions, we're gonna push the limits. Like, this woman's gonna get up and give a testimony. I see that happening. Is that a great big picture solution? I don't know, but you got to work with where people are at. I get messages over social media, private messages, where people say, should I leave my church? And then, I'm kind of ambivalent about that because, this is a pastor who asked me, should he leave his church because he's kind of become egalitarian? And I said, I don't tell people what to do. I just say, if you feel like, okay, I got to take a stand, then leave. But if you feel like I can exercise agency from the inside in my community, I think there is a place for that.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really helpful. I mean, I think it's helpful to hear that because some people will say, well, I'm not going to get into this book because I kind of already know the arguments. And I have to say, like, I know lots of the arguments. I've read lots of things, and I found this to be a unique perspective and particularly helpful, even in my own thinking on the topic. So let's get into a few topics, and we could talk about Junia, which is a popular conversation starter with a lot of people. Can you talk really quickly, for those who don't know, about the shift in how Junia was viewed and why that's important, and the distinct background of Junia that you highlight as a possibility that is worth thinking about?
Sure. If you pull out your, 1980s NASB or, I think even the King James, you're going to see in Romans 16:7 the name Junias with an S. So it'll say, greet Andronicus and Junias, my kinsmen, blah, blah, blah. And what that means is, a lot of people don't know this, but the S on Junias signals that it's a man. And so a lot of translations from English translation for the 20th century early, middle 20th century will have that. And if you open up a Bible translation now, especially, like NIV or NRSV, it'll say Junia. And so just to listeners, that signals it's a woman. So there's been this question over the last century or so, is this a man or a woman? Because there is kind of some ambiguity in the Greek text on that. But there's a scholar named Eldon Epp who was writing, I think, in the late 90s. And he actually revealed that there was kind of an intentional corruption of the translation tradition starting in the medieval period. Why is this an issue? Because it appears that these people are called apostles. They were prominent among the apostles. That's a controversy in itself. We could talk about that later. But sometime in the medieval period, translators, scholars concluded, okay, Paul couldn't have said this about a woman. So it must be a man. So kind of from then on, maybe the 13th century, the name was changed to a male name, even though the name Junia is a female name. So it was changed from Junia to Junias. Thanks to scholars like Bernadette Bruton, Eldon Epp, and others, this has been recovered, that this is a woman. And one of the ways, Drew, that we know this is patristic testimony. So we're talking about writers, Christian writers from the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century, people who are close to the biblical period, the apostolic period, people who are what we call helophones. They're writing in Greek, so their Greek is pretty good. And
you have to explain hellophone because somebody hears hella anything today.
Yeah, hella. Yeah, they're hella good.
They're hella
at
real.
Hellophone means that Greek is their first language. They speak Greek. And so you have, these writers like Chrysostom or Origen, who take for granted, most of them, all of them, I think, take for granted it's a woman, and most of them take for granted that she's an apostle. Exactly what that means, we can talk about. But, I think actually her identity was buried for hundreds of years, only to be fully recovered in the last, about 30, 40 years.
And just to be clear, when we say it was recovered, or we can see in the medieval period the shift in how they're, maybe even the new spelling of the name, this is all manuscript evidence, correct?
Yeah. Copies and copies of Romans in different languages, but once we start to see it emerge in English, we see the male name, even though if we go back to the Greek copies and the patristic testimony of 2nd, 3rd, 4th century, nobody was saying this is a guy named Junius or Junianus, some scholars say, the kind of full name. Nobody really says that. So because of the overwhelming testimony of that early period, and then what we've inherited from the medieval period, especially in English, later medieval period, it seems like there was some kind of corruption, and now that we know better.
And for those playing along at home who has their Nestle Aland 28 open or 27, will they see this in the apparatus?
Not really, because this gets really nerdy, but the technical apparatus really follows as many early manuscripts as you can. All the Greek manuscripts say essentially the same thing. There might be actually a change of name to Julia, because Julia is a popular female name, but you're not going to see a change of name to a male name because there was no male name. It's actually a conjecture that there's a male name named Junianus. We're going real deep.
I love it.
Greek manuscripts here.
This is the podcast to do that on.
That's right. Yeah, so the apparatus isn't going to tell you really anything. I would say if you want to follow up on this, read Eldon Epp's book. I can't remember the name of it, but EPP is his last name. You're not going to see that there. Junia is a widely attested female name in Greek in that time. Junias or Junianus is not attested at all. So it's actually a fabrication. It's a guess. Okay, there might be a name like this. So it's, as a guess, it just loses out to the fact that Junia is a female name.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so one of the things that you try to show in this book is that that female leaders were noticed by the early church, as you just said with Junius. But with Phoebe, I thought the discussion of the actual manuscript, the paratext and the manuscript, how that how that shows us that Phoebe had this special role to play, I guess, in the delivery of Romans. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm not going to excavate the whole book, but there are some tidbits here that I think are so good.
No, this is fascinating because there's been this conversation going on okay, so let's start a little bit earlier in kind of modern history with Mike Bird. And Mike, Mike's a good friend of mine, Australian, teaches at Ridley Melbourne. And he's kind of gone through a change of mind on these issues about women. And he said before, and I think a few different places, that Romans 16 actually played a role in that, kind of along the lines of what I'm arguing in my book. We could talk about gender roles, but then when we see what women actually do, they're on the front lines of ministry. So we didn't mention this about Junia, but she went to prison for ministry. And that's a pretty serious thing. She's not playing behind the scene roles in ministry. She's actually out front getting in trouble with the authorities. Okay, Phoebe, manuscripts, as they're copied, sometimes people will put in annotations or little marginal notes in a manuscript for comprehension. So, for example, we think the original versions of the Gospels didn't have authorial titles. So the Gospel of Mark didn't start out the Gospel of Mark. It's, the Gospel of Jesus Christ, right? The beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ. So there we have this kata markon in Greek, which means according to Mark. That may have actually been a note added to the Gospel. The scholars disagree about that, but that may have been a note added as several Gospels were written. We need to differentiate. This is the Mark one. Okay, so with Romans, we actually see sometimes subscriptions or postscriptions. These are little annotations at the beginning or end of a document that add some information. So actually some manuscripts say, I can't remember the exact wording, but Paul's letter to the Romans through Phoebe. They add Phoebe somehow into it. And what they're trying to say there is she's the letter carrier.
Is it Dia Phoebe?
I'm not 100%. I'd have to look it up,
Okay.
but something like that. And, that means they kind of take it for granted. And even later on, I think I mentioned John Calvin says this as well. He just takes it for granted. Now, a big part of my book is not just the activities, but what they mean in context. So when the Amazon person delivers a package to my house, I don't ever even see that person. They just drop it and ring the doorbell and leave. Sometimes they knock. And I'll go to the door, open it, and I'll yell, "Thank you." They may be at their car. They may be back at their truck, and I'm yelling, "Thank you." I don't have a relationship with this, delivery person. But in the ancient world, if it wasn't kind of government mail, which went through kind of official channels, if it was private mail, you had to either hire somebody, which we don't think the early Christians did, or send it through a slave, which I hope they didn't do, but they probably did, or send it through a friend. And if you sent it through a trusted friend, one thing we learn about these letter carriers, Drew, is they were really important. They were often traveling long distances. It was dangerous. Think about Epaphroditus from Philippians who almost died. It's dangerous. These documents were really important to the early Christians, right? Think about Romans, how important it is, right? You don't want to, oops, I lost it on the way, or I dropped it in a puddle. You don't want that. They may have been sealed. So you really had to put a lot of trust in this person. And so you're sending this person there. What we learned from scholars like Peter Head and others who have studied letter carriers is they were basically an agent of the sender. I refer to as a proxy. And so just think about Phoebe. Some people think she read the letter. Some people think she didn't. Whatever the case, I think the more important thing is if the people listening are upset or have questions, who are they going to talk to? They're going to talk to Phoebe because she's eventually going back there. And they're like, you tell Paul, I don't like this part, right? They're going to say that to her. So she's negotiating on behalf of Paul. She's kind of being invested with some of his apostolic power. I think that's one of the reasons that her church title is diakonos is named.
Yeah, and I even the presumption that she probably spent some time with Paul on the front end and could answer some questions that might arise in that context. And again, if it's a Jewish room that she's reading this letter to, or whoever's reading the letter to, Well, everything I know about ancient Judaism suggests that there's going to be some pushback.
Yeah.
There's going to be
Absolutely.
some
I mean,
vigorous discussion.
he starts out by saying, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, which implies he's kind of being a little bit defensive here. He has some hard words. He says, and I think towards the end of the letter, I'm being bold to say these things to you. He says, watch out for these things, watch out for these people. So he's saying, and he says, I haven't been there before. So, Phoebe
Right.
is in many ways the face of Paul to these people. And, Drew, a lot of people don't think about when Paul's writing this, he's in Corinth or Cenchrea, which are neighboring towns. And he has a lot of male friends in Corinth. Many of them leaders, Stephanas, Achaeus, Gaius. He knows a lot of people there. He could have sent, if he wanted to send a letter with a man, he could have. If he wanted to send a letter with a male leader, he had a lot of them to choose from. And so the choice of Phoebe seems to be strategic for a variety of reasons.
It wasn't just like, hey, you're heading towards Rome. Why don't you take this letter with you, right?
I think that's an older perspective. And I think now that we've learned more about letter carriers and more about diakonoi, diakonos, what that means, I think we're in a better position to say this was more of a strategic decision rather than you happen to already have a bus ticket. Can you drop this off on your way?
Yeah, I don't know if you've seen it too on the receiving side. Brian Wright's book, Communal Reading in the Time of Jesus, is a great little text on what happens when it enters that crowd as well, and that would have been a pretty vigorous discussion going on in the receiving church.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, that was very helpful. And you identified 3 myths. I have to admit, maybe it's just the lazy scholar in me. I love listicles now from experts, not just general listicles, but when somebody actually knows what they're talking about.
Yeah.
And I've heard Lynn Cohick talk about this a little bit as well. But the 3 ones you identify were that wives were always under the legal authority of their husbands, that women couldn't own property, and that women lived privately in the home, kind of like they couldn't let the sun dawn on their face in the street kind of idea. And you say, no, that's not exactly what's going on. Those are caricatures that have some basis in reality, but not entirely true. I guess the question is, why is this important for the grander argument that you're making about how women were actually functioning in Roman society?
Yeah. I think that, the theological world that I kind of entered when I became a Christian, in the late 90s was largely influenced by the Council for Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. I read Grudem's Systematic Theology in college. I once drove 16 hours to listen to John Piper speak. I was really all in on that. And when you read their work, I feel like what they're nostalgic for is a 1950s, 1960s, Leave It to Beaver form of marriage and gender roles. So when they talk about gender roles, and it's fascinating to track when the language of gender roles entered, the discourse, which is kind of in that period. What I notice as I've been, what I try to do in my book is do a reset by focusing as much I can on dialogue with Roman historians, modern Roman historians, classic scholars, to get the best picture possible of what life was actually like for men and women in the ancient world, and specifically in the Roman world, which was kind of an innovation. Many things that happened in the Roman world didn't happen in the Greek world before it or in other cultures. And we can go on and on and on about that, and I can give lots of examples. But marriage in the household is interesting. Just to take one important cultural phenomenon today, the go home fiasco with Beth Moore. So, I'm sure listeners remember that John MacArthur, when he was asked about 2 words that come to mind with Beth Moore, he said, go home. And that is kind of encapsulation of this, Council of Biblical Womanhood mentality that a woman's place is in the home, a man's place is at work or in the church. And what I want to do is really mess with that and complicate that. So, for example, there's a scholar who won't be mentioned, but I mention him in the book. There's a scholar that talks about Priscilla and Aquila and how when Priscilla and Aquila teach Apollos the more thorough knowledge he needs as an evangelist and teacher, one scholar says, by taking him to their home, that takes it out of the ministry context and it places it more in a private, non-official setting. And what I said, and only once in the book do I get kind of salty and acerbic in my response to another scholar. And that's the time, and I'm glad that my editor didn't take it out, although maybe I should have. But what I basically say is that is a profound misunderstanding of how homes operate in the ancient world. So for example, Drew, we're looking at each other right now. I don't know if listeners know that. And you can see into my house. So this is interesting because it's my private setting. You know, I have a bunch of dirty clothes on the ground you can't see. And it's a public setting because I use this space publicly for teaching and for podcasts and other things. And Roman houses played that function where they were used for sleeping and changing and bathing, but they were also used for business and work. They were used for public settings like parties, social engagements. Someone who came to your house, you know, like a beggar looking for hospitality, could step into a semi-public space to make those requests. Even more public than our porches, modern porches. So this idea that Priscilla and Aquila go to their house, and what I asked this, you know, other academic is, where else are they going to take him? There were no churches. Right. Also, one scholar that I work with a lot, a Roman scholar, name is Emily Hemmelrich. She doesn't engage in biblical stuff, but she does point out that people kept their libraries in their homes. And so if they wanted to discuss things in depth and they want to open up, you know, their texts, they're going to go to a home because that's where you kept those things. You might keep them sometimes in a business place, but their business place may have also been their home. So I wanted to clear up a lot of these misunderstandings that come from what I call a snow globe understanding of the ancient world. You know, a snow globe of New York City is going to have these staples, but it's not going to reflect real New York City. And a snow globe of the Roman world is going to have these, you know, assumptions, which doesn't reflect the reality. What I want to do is explicate the reality.
Yeah, and even a snow globe of New York City is going to have Times Square, Empire State Building, maybe the World Trade Center, which is where New Yorkers don't go, right? Those are the tourist places, right? So this kind of on-the-ground reality, which I thought was just so helpful, and that's part of what our other book was trying to do, is get people back into the homesteads and Iron Age and Greco-Roman world and see what people's lives were actually like. And there were things that were divided up gender-wise, but it's not necessarily exactly why you think or how you think that is the case. Okay, so we're going to do a speed round in a second, but last question before we get there, because I got to the end of the book proper and I thought, like, wait, he didn't deal with any of the hotly contested text, and then I flipped the page and it's, and here are the hotly contested. It was the perfectly timed things, right? Which shows you I didn't read the table of contents when I started in the book. So
you were just too excited.
I was. I that's true. I just wanted to get straight into it. So maybe we should just let people read that section for themselves. But I do think, you know, just to give one on the table, because I know everybody's going to go straight to the issue of 1 Timothy, right? I do not let a woman speak. Can you just talk really quickly, so that you don't, and not too much of a spoiler there, but really quickly about how understanding the use of authenteo in that context really does make a difference in how you understand the text.
Yeah. Let me say a couple things. Let me say kind of a preface statement first. Because anytime almost anytime I post on, you know, my support of women in ministry on social media, I'll get somebody just post 1 Timothy 2, you know, as kind of a mic drop. And
I'm going to just start replying to everything you do with 1 Timothy 2.
That is kind of a, there needs to be some 1 Timothy 2 emoji just to simplify it for people. But, you know, what I've thought about more recent days, just in the last week or two, is the reality that scholars are trying to integrate disparate pieces of information. So it's kind of like, this is the first time I'm explaining this way, Drew, so I hope this is exciting. It's kind of like investigating a crime scene. You may come across contradictory evidence, right? Someone's alibi doesn't work out, or they're lying, but then you have this, you know, stain on the carpet, or, you know, all this stuff. And you have to construct a plausible theory that tries to make sense of everything while still recognizing that some things may still not make sense. and the problem with the way that a lot of people approach this is they just look at one text and they say, this text says everything I need to know. And the whole point of my book is to say, when you have so many women out there doing public ministry on the front lines, going to prison, teaching people like Apollos, right? You have the patristic testimony about all of this stuff. You can't just ignore that. And so you have to actually find a way to integrate this material. So then the question is, do I start with 1 Timothy and then place everything else subordinate to that? Do I start with these named women and, or do I do something else? So just starting there, we have to say, this is more complex than I've settled my view in 1 Timothy. Therefore, women can't be elders or pastors. End of story. That's just not the way it works. We have to try to integrate all the information. Okay. One of the things that's helped me is to start with something very simple that I learned from Nicholas Walterstorff, and that is we have to rely on the clearest texts on any issue in Scripture. And I've had so many people say, 1 Timothy 2 is so clear. And what I say is, it's clear in English, but not in Greek. Now, I'm not trying to pull some kind of magic trick by saying that. I don't know if you know this, Drew, but, in the Lord's Prayer, there's a word in there that we have absolutely no idea what it means. It's epiousios, and we translate it daily. But if you open up a commentary, you open up patristic discussions, we actually don't know what this word means. So this is, the Lord's Prayer is the most cited, most repeated, most memorized, most discussed text in all of literature. And there's a word that we actually don't know what it means. So that's actually real. That's a real problem, that sometimes we don't know what words mean, or we're guessing. And that doesn't happen very often in the New Testament.
Right.
Based on frequency, based on patristic usage, based on other thing, context, we can figure out what words mean. There's a word here at the actual center of this text. 1 Timothy 2, 11 through 15. We actually don't know what it means, or it's highly debated. So it's this word authenteo, which you've already mentioned, and sometimes it's translated have authority. That's kind of a guess, because what we're depending on is word frequency, right? When I want to buy a product like a vacuum or, a Christmas tree or whatever, a fake Christmas tree, I go on Amazon or wherever, and I look at a bunch of reviews. The more reviews, the better chance I have at knowing how good this thing is. It's kind of that way with semantics, like lexicosemantics, understanding what words mean in the New Testament. We depend on lots of uses. The more uses, the better. So ideally we want thousands. If we can't in all of Greek literature, and if we can get that in the New Testament, that's great. If not, hundreds. If not, many dozens. With this one, we've only been able to find about 8 to 10 uses of this word within kind of that time period. Now compare that to another word for authority like exousia, which is very common in the New Testament. We have that hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times.
In the Gospels, that's authority over men, and Paul, this is basically the main word that's used throughout.
The key word. So you have to ask yourself not only what the word means, because we're not really sure, but why would Paul use a rare word? Rare words usually indicate unusual circumstances, right? There's a debate, and I don't know how deep you want to go, but whether the word means to have authority in a neutral sense or in a positive sense, or to domineer over somebody, or to usurp authority, or to abuse with authority in a negative sense. So one thing a question I raise in this chapter that I have is, if this is a common teaching of Paul, this is what he tells all his churches, this is just what he believes about men and women in the church. Number one, why is this the only time he says it? Mm-hmm. He doesn't use this in 1 Corinthians 11. He doesn't use it in 1 Corinthians 14. He doesn't use it in the submission passages of the Colossians and Ephesians. It doesn't appear in 1 Peter's household text. So why is it not there? Secondly, why would you use a rare word when any of us, when we use a rare word, could be misunderstood? So I'm problematizing that. Again, scholars work with theories, right? So I have to create a theory then to explain this. So my theory is I lean in favor of scholars like Cindy Westphal, who say it's actually not women wanting equal power with men, but women actually wanting to usurp authority or domineer over men. And Paul is basically saying, no, we're not going to allow that. It's a theory, but I think it's a theory that can explain a lot of things in the text.
Would you see that as having some transference power with explaining 1 Corinthians and the head coverings, so that there might be something also going on there along the same lines?
Yeah, it's interesting to me that we have a number of texts throughout the New Testament that deal with kind of clash of the sexes or clash of gender. I don't know exactly why, and there's all kinds of reasons this could be kind of culturally. But I do think something in terms of gender disrespect is going on in 1 Corinthians 11. I've gone over that. I've sat down so many times, Drew, and said, I'm going to read the Greek text and I'm going to
see what it says.
Problem. I'm going to, and every time I come up with goose egg, there's so much in here that doesn't make sense. So just take the headship language. Head over, head over, head over. Doesn't mean authority, doesn't mean a source. I don't know. Like it can't be exactly what Paul thinks, because he doesn't see a cascading head where Christ is only the head over men and then men is the head over women. Why do we know that? Because there's so many widows out there. I just read recently a statistic there that maybe 1 out of every 4 adult women were widows. So you have lots of widows out there who don't have, a pater familias, a husband to rely on. So what are they going to do? Is this a marriage thing? And if it is a marriage thing, then and all of a sudden we're allowing unmarried women to be pastors and elders and bishops. How can we explain that from a capability standpoint or cultural standpoint? So I think there are these issues. We don't know exactly what's going on. I think ultimately what Paul wants is harmony and respect. We can have more conversation about that, but that's kind of the clearest thing I think we can land on.
Yeah, that's good. And a lot of what you're saying is basically we just need to norm the data in context, right? This does kind of remind me of Kevin Rose, his argument that there's this kind of it's in a different format, but this encyclopedist bent but I find that in the church there is this kind of like each data point in Scripture is equal to every other data point in Scripture. So if Jesus said, my big one is Jesus says there's no marriage in heavens, I'm like, then there's no marriage in heavens. And I'm kind of the same thing, like, wait, time out. Marriage is a covenant as part of the covenant of creation. This is the only place he says it. This phrase only occurs in judgment text of the eschaton. Like, what's going on here? Which again, that move to norm the data, I find a lot of people are resistant to it. Oh, this is my observation. You tell me what you think. Only when they already have a prior strong belief about the thing that they don't want to norm the data about, right?
Well, I start out my book by using the kind of focal image of the book and movie Hidden Figures. And I do that because that's kind of what happened to me. That's part of my story where, the Hidden Figures is about these African-American women who were quote unquote computers. They're analysts and scientists who were kind of behind, kind of space achievements. But their stories were hidden. And so we write textbooks and we make movies about kind of the Neil Armstrongs, the Buzz Aldrins, and the achievements of these women are kind of buried in history and only to be revealed later. And now they're renaming buildings after these women. A lot of it is paradigmatic. So my students, I teach a course on women in the New Testament. I've taught it twice. I'm going to teach again next year. And students are often angry, they're crying, they're confused, and they say, why am I only hearing these stories for the first time? Nympha, Euodia, Syntyche, Tryphena, Tryphosa, Mary, right? The mother of Nereus, Persis. Why am I only hearing about these people now? Mary Magdalene was a real, was apostle to the apostles, and the only answer I can give to them is, for better or for worse, our preachers and teachers have framed Scripture in a certain way. And we need to check those frames, make sure they're legitimate, make sure they're accurate, make sure that we see what culture may have hidden. And I think we've done that, and I think there needs to be recovery there. So I love the title. The title actually comes from our great IVP team, but tell her story. One of the echoes of that title is, I think, Hamilton's "Who Lives, Who Dies, Who Tells Your Story," about Hamilton's wife, right? Who is kind of a lesser known figure, but really important. I think that's what we're trying to do. I try to say in my introduction, because people are going to think what I'm doing is revisionist, and I make it clear I'm not being revisionist. It's an exercise in amplification. We want to understand better these figures in their own world. And when we see that, we see, gosh, if we say women can't be elders because their places in the home, or they're not good enough at leadership. I have this conversation with students a lot. I say, one of the really crazy things about the Gospels is the fact that in Jesus's, let's say, teenage and 20s, he doesn't have a male mentor in his life. So you would know this just from knowing the ancient world. Fathers die, but then an uncle steps in, or a grandparent, or a neighbor. You know what I mean? The fact that Jesus is just hanging out with his mom is kind of strange in the ancient world. It's a bit of an anomaly. And so this idea that in some of Jesus's most formative years of coming of age, God gives him this woman, Mary, what we think of as kind of lower class, blue collar, as his primary formative mentor, places a lot of weight on her shoulders. I mean, right up until the very end of his life, who shows up at the cross? It's not Uncle Frank. You know what I mean? We don't hear about any uncles. Right? It's really interesting. We don't hear about these kind of surrogate fathers. We hear about Mary, and just, I've been appreciative of these books in recent years, like Amy Peeler's book, Women, the Gender of God, that have really said, we need to take Mary more seriously, not as a divine figure, not as, for Protestants, not as necessarily a saint, but God putting a ton. I hate to use the word risk because it makes it seem like God's not in control. I'm more comfortable with that, but I understand it makes people really nervous. But this idea that this is part of the plan, that, hey, if Mary can raise the Savior, I think my wife could do a pretty good job as an elder.
Yeah, and Mary, it's not that she's, because I can imagine some people would just say, well, yes, but she's his mother. Of course, she has to. That's her job. And we're like, well, the father, he has to. That's his job. Whatever happens to him, we don't know. But also, at least Luke's gospel is very particular. She is paying attention and sees what's going on. I mean, she is the Hannah of the first century that seems to understand the big picture. And maybe the only one that understands the big picture throughout Jesus' actual life and ministry. Okay, I'm going to change the beat a little bit here we're going to do a speed round. And I'm going to ask you some stock and not so stock questions. But the first stock question is, what biblical theological work has influenced you most as a thinker? And we'll say on gender.
On gender. Okay. I would say the book Discovering Biblical Equality, which came out right around when I was in seminary. Massive book, just dropped like a bomb. It was the 800-page response to the Piper Grudem tome, and Gordon Fee, Craig Keener, Linda Belleville. I mean, you had these kind of big names. I think maybe Ben Witherington as well, and just kind of brought an evangelical voice to the conversation that made it more approachable for me as someone with high commitment to Scripture and kind of mainstream Christianity. So that is one I continue to turn to a lot.
Nice. In 3 to 5 words, this is going to be tricky for you, but 3 to 5 words, what's the biggest problem with Matt Bates' Pistis as Allegiance view?
Ooh, okay.
Because Matt doesn't he doesn't listen to the podcast, so you can say whatever you want. He'll never know.
I would say not nuanced enough.
Ooh, dang.
But that's a normal problem with short books.
Yeah,
I'm okay with that.
Yeah, popular engagement books. Yeah. Which skit in Portlandia hits the most different for you? Which one is the one that really you think nails it? It's a lot to choose from.
Since we're being goofy, there's this great episode where these people go to a raw foods restaurant for the first time and they have farting and non-farting sections. And
I haven't
it's just
seen that one.
not only is that, realistic to Portland, but I've been on all sorts of, hippie diets and that I can, without giving away too much, I can attest
Right.
that having those sections makes sense.
Now I want to ask, what's the second place one?
There's one I remember that's like bicycle rights. This guy's like into bicycle rights because he's a bike delivery person, and then he ends up getting a car, and then he gets mad at the bicycle rights people. There is a big war in Portland over, cyclists versus drivers, and there's snobbiness. Now you have electric bicycles and, all kinds of stuff. So I would say just the snob level of hippiness is very accurate in Portlandia.
I heard an interview with them, and apparently the bookstore that shows up the feminist bookstore that shows up in a lot of scenes is an actual feminist bookstore.
I think it is. Yeah.
And the women who owned the feminist bookstore did not know what their store is being rented out to film until they saw it on the show. So.
Well, I know one of your good friends, Carmen Imes. She was here in Portland, over the summer, I think, and we met her at a restaurant on the east side. And as we were walking in, we saw Carrie Brownstein drive around the corner. So
there you go.
Exciting.
It's your own little New York City there. What is one of the most awkward things that's ever happened to you in class? Now, you teach a lot of classes remote, or some classes remote. So it could be a remote issue, or it could be an in-class thing.
I mean, I don't know. Do you teach online too?
I did for the last 2 years, but thank goodness, no.
I would say, and I'm not bothered by this, but I can see how people would be, like people in their pajamas.
Yes.
It's late at night in some places. People in bed, people eating, gets kind of awkward, especially if they're at like the dinner table or something. I would say probably
during class you've had people at the dinner table.
I mean, everything. This is just life, right? Okay. I would say the thing I like the least would be when someone's in the car and they're zooming with their phone, and I just like, what liability do I have if they get into an accident? You know what I mean? Right. I'm like, turn your camera off.
I can't call 911. I don't know where you're at.
Like if they're in a parking lot, pulled over, fine. Yeah. But if they're driving, like that scares the bejeebus out of me.
You should have a clause. If I teach remote again, I'm gonna have a clause that says if you're driving, then you need to like put me on Find My Friends so I know exactly where you're at. Yeah. So in case you wreck, I know which police department.
I don't know. I want plausible deniability.
That's true. Too, that's true. Do you believe in aliens, extraterrestrial aliens?
I would say no. I would say if they did exist, we would have found them by now.
Okay.
Or they would have found us.
This is a Matt Bates question, but again, because he never listens to this podcast that he started, we can say whatever we want. Are you familiar with the Tic Tac vehicle?
No.
Okay. Well, it's a recent alien phenomenon. I'm not a big fan of aliens either. But I mean, the idea that there are aliens, mainly because I feel like Jesus came in human form, and then you have this other issue of like, does he come in other forms? And,
I mean, if you remember the Larry Norman song, from the 70s. I don't know
any Larry Norman songs. So
you don't know Larry Norman?
No, but I know a guy who wrote that.
There's a song called UFO. He's an unidentified flying object. It's a good song.
So you were raised in Christian culture.
No, my parents are Hindu, so not exactly. I became a Christian in high school, but I went pretty deep into CCM, Christian music.
You did a deep dive.
I grew up in a small town Midwest, and so like every station on the radio is Christian or country, which is also considered Christian. And so yeah,
they got both kinds of music, Christian and country.
Christian and the other Christian.
Yeah. Okay, so I went on New Yorker magazine. They had a webpage devoted to feminist knock-knock jokes. Some that I probably could not repeat on this podcast, but I'll give you a couple, see if you can play along here. So, knock-knock.
Who's there?
Impatient feminist.
Impatient feminist.
Why don't we have equal pay yet?
Okay.
That made it onto the New Yorker magazine. Right. Knock-knock.
Who's there?
Annie.
Annie who?
Anything you can do so that I can get 58 cents on the dollar.
Okay.
Yeah. These are
clever.
I was a little disappointed, to tell you the truth.
This isn't representing feminism that well.
Oh, that's what I thought too. And
I don't think women wrote these jokes.
Yeah, that's a good point. It probably could be. But I wonder if some people just see what you're doing as kind of exhibit A of caving in to woke culture and just kind of giving people what they want rather than what Scripture says. What's your throwback on that?
I've been thinking a lot about this because I've been in dialogue with a few scholars on social media about, are egalitarians like myself deluded? Are we bending Scripture? Are we manipulating, all this stuff? I'm going to get a little bit theoretical here, which I know you love. But scholarship is dialectic in the sense that you want to be as objective as possible. At the same time, you're a human being with cultural experiences. At the same time, you try to have your work peer reviewed. At the same time, your peer review is going to be in favor of you in many cases. So there's this dialectic. There's this constant ping pong going back and forth between, on the one hand, the desire for objectivity, neutrality, and at the same time, what we write comes out of our passions. Mm-hmm. We don't ask third-party neutral people to write impassioned books on these subjects because for the fact they're not interested in it. So then the question is, then I would rely on a couple things. One is, I asked for peer review of my book, internally from IVP. I asked them to give me, as much direct, feedback as I can and incorporate that and all of that. I know that's limited, but that's important. Second thing is, and you could tell me if this is illegitimate or not, Drew, but I would say credibility. If I wrote this 10 years ago before I wrote anything else, I think it'd be pretty easy to say, what does this guy know? Mm-hmm. I hope, having written biblical commentaries, work on translation committee, the credentials I have, the work I've done on Scripture, I'm putting my reputation on the line for this in the sense that I'm willing to take a stand, having been in the business for a long time, having developed friendships across the spectrum of scholars and scholarship. So I think there needs to, this kind of happened, for example, with John Stott when he, kind of vocalized his view of annihilationism, this idea that he doesn't believe in eternal conscious torment as hell. I think that that opened the pathway for people to think about that more because it's John Stott, versus just some conspiracy theorist on the internet saying, hey, this is true. I think who you are should be taken into consideration. Is this person known for reliable, in-depth scholarship that's careful, genuine, engaging across the spectrum? What I didn't want the book to do was just pad the footnotes with egalitarian scholars. You notice I don't do that very much.
Right.
I try to engage as much with real historical texts from the Roman world and Roman historians that would be neutral or ignorant of our theological conversation. So I would hope that I would get a hearing. There's actually been one review posted. The very first review posted was on something called NetGalley, which kind of allows people to see books ahead of time for review purposes. And it was actually by, I think, a Southern Baptist. And he said in his review, I disagreed with some of the major conclusions of the book related to women as elders and pastors, but I learned a lot from the book, and I'm inspired by the women who contributed in great ways to the gospel, something like that. I appreciate that. I appreciate that they're able to say, I by the end of the book, I didn't agree with X, Y, and Z, but I learned a lot from the book. That to me is, I'm proud of that people could come to those kinds of conclusions, having not agreed with some of my big ideas.
Yeah, it's every book you look for small and big wins, right?
That's right.
Yeah, so that's great. We just got back from SBL, Society for Biblical Literature meeting. What is just a good memory you have from that? And don't say conversations, Conversations with friends.
No, I want to plug the Institute for Biblical Research, which is, a society of, 500 to 1,000 scholars. I hesitate to use evangelical, even though that's convenient, but they're confessional scholars who teach at a lot of Christian colleges and universities and seminaries. And they have really grown over the years into supporting certain constituencies which didn't exist when I was a student. So, for example, they have a breakfast for women scholars, they have a special breakfast for minority scholars, and they have a special coffee hour for students, especially PhD students. And I was invited to speak in that group, the student group, and just to see the support in the room, to see scholars there supporting students. Like, Drew, I didn't have this as a student. Right. It didn't mean I was on my own. I had a great cohort of other students, but to have intentional mentoring scenarios, to have scholars like myself speak on what I wish they asked me, like what I wish I knew when I was a PhD student. And there's a lot. Like, I would have loved to have that. And I'm so happy and this is a student-led initiative. I'm so happy they're doing that. So that was probably my favorite memory, that coffee hour, just to see this group of people in this room who felt supported. Like, that's really important.
Yeah. I feel like SBL, it's not a toxic place, but there's sectors of SBL the tension is high in the room. Like, you can cut it, and there's just little cat fights and stuff like that. Not everywhere, but there's definitely places where that's true. And I feel like IVR tends to be a little bit more of a respite. And you still get good research, good vigorous dialogue and debate in those sessions as well. I have to say also a thanks to you, because you were that kind of person to me. You were right. I don't know how many people know this, but you and has Ben Blackwell, right? You guys used to write.
Oh yeah, that's right.
On blogs back in the day when people blogged, macro blogged rather than micro blogged, and you wrote all the stuff about what it's like to do a PhD in the UK. And I accidentally stumbled into a PhD program in the UK, but immediately needed to know everything I could, and so I read everything you wrote for about 6 months. And it was extremely helpful to me and my wife, even things like how to open a bank account in the UK, which is a great service of supporting fellow scholars. And you've written books since then, helping people who are entering scholarship to think about what it means and how it works, and to bring them into this alien landscape of biblical scholarship. So thank you very much for your wisdom and your service to the community over the years. And thank you for being on OnScript for the third time.
Well, I appreciate it. I'm a listener. In the evenings after the kids go to bed, I play video games, and I'll put on OnScript or another podcast and try to learn something while I'm kind of vegging out. So it's kind of one of my go-tos. So I appreciate your ministry as well.
All right. Peace to you. And thank you all very much for listening.
You've been listening to OnScript, delectable conversations on scripture and theology. If this episode has brought you inner peace or lit your biblical fire, please consider a small donation of just $2 or $5 per month. Information on how to donate can be found at onscript.study/donate.